Okay, and hello, and welcome to this supplement to the last video, which was about prescriptivism in the early modern period. This is about the stuff that escapes prescriptivism. We're talking about regional varieties and registers. We're talking about the fact that people will use the English language differently depending on who they're talking to, why they're talking, where they're talking, right? Regional varieties, where, registers, how fancy, how formal. We can talk about informal registers of the language versus formal registers of the language. We still have this. And we can talk about different kind of sociolects, as it's sometimes called, the class dialects, and so on and so forth. All of this leads us to a aspect of historical linguistic research as we get into this period that changes somewhat with the development of print and the massive increase of the amount of materials available to us. When we're doing philology, like old school philology of comparing early Old English texts to Gothic inscriptions or something like that, we have to do a lot with a little. You're like the archaeologist who is trying to work out from a series of broken pots and small walls who lived here, how they lived, what kind of animals they raised, what their life was like, right? And you have to sort of fill in a lot of blanks. As we get into the 1600s, 1700s, and into the 1800s, we have so many texts. We have such a huge amount of language. And a collection of texts as a whole from a period or for a language or for an area we refer to as a corpus. And so corpus linguistics is the study of language as expressed in corpora, that is, samples of real-world text. As opposed to, traditional sort of theoretical linguistics, syntax, morphology, synchronic linguistics deals with language as a kind of a concept, as, the rules of the language, is what the knowledge that a native speaker ideally has, who has a perfect knowledge of their language. Corpus linguistics deals with the messy reality of how people actually use language. And in modern times, corpuses also can refer to transcriptions. It can deal with taped recordings, audio recordings, and stuff like that. But in the early modern period, it deals with print and manuscript sources. And corpus linguistics can bring in a certain amount of analytical work in which we look through the corpus, through this collection of samples for phonetic, lexical, morphosyntactic, orthographic features. Orthographic means spelling, remember? And also discourse related, like what types and situations of communication are we looking at? For example, are we looking at legal records? Are we looking at letters? Are we looking at scientific documents? Are we looking at court transcripts of speech by illiterate people? And in which case we then need to think about what shape or effect that the act of recording or taking down has on the corpus. So this is corpus linguistics. And I'm probably not doing it justice. It's a much bigger topic than this. But corpus linguistics will often involve identifying varieties, at least when we're using it for the purpose of historical linguistics. And this is just to slightly review some of the concepts we looked at in the core sociolinguistic concepts video. We can look at functional varieties used for particular purposes or situations. Think about when you listen to gamers talk or sports fans talk or fashion enthusiasts, right? There's a whole vocabulary of taste, of movement, of action, of affiliation. There are also and then there's functional varieties, if you're talking about cars or computers or textile arts, whatever it is. Then there are geographical varieties, right? In Britain, there will be different ways of speaking. In London, in Warwickshire, in Scotland, in North America, there will be different ways of speaking. In New England, in what's called the Tidewater, which is the coastal South as opposed to the eastern coastal South, as opposed to the upland South, as opposed to the Gulf Coast, the deep South, the Gulf Coast, right? Western English, Canadian English. And then there's social varieties. These are class varieties. And a term that gets used in sociolinguistics, once again, is acrolect, which is a high, prestigious form of a language spoken by rich and powerful people, versus a basilect, which is a language spoken by just often a stigmatized form of language spoken by lower class people. And then another term that we can get that gets used, which isn't in addition to, but can kind of go with all of these, is discourse varieties. We can talk about discourses of law, medicine, religion, politics, academia, education, all kinds of things. So a dialect is a term that gets used somewhat loosely. It doesn't really have a specific linguistic meaning. But it's often used in practice to mean a non-standard variety. And most of our records of non-standard varieties from the past are in writing. And some of this writing is often in the form of literature, where authors would want to represent characters realistically by representing the speech that they use. Mark Twain is an example of a Missouri author, an American author, who uses what's called I dialect. That is a written form, a written representation of what the sound of dialect sounds like to a speaker of roughly standard English. The 16th century author Edmund Spenser used archaic forms like thilk for like that kind over there to characterize the speech of rustic shepherds. And it's often true that people who are out of the way use kind of more old-fashioned forms. Shakespeare uses regional varieties for characterization. We have Edgar, who assumes the guise of a peasant in King Lear, and Shakespeare represents this through the representation. Good gentlemen, go your gait and let poor Volk pass. The Volk here as opposed to folk. And shoulda been swaggered out of my life. Should have is represented should ha. Swaggered is represented as zwaggered, and so on and so forth. It's a kind of systematic representation of a dialect. We also, in Henry V, in a scene representing the unity of all the British peoples, have a Scots and an Irishman talking, and there's a kind of visual representation of that there, which I'm not going to attempt right now. So there are regional variations, and in week 7 we're going to talk more about regional varieties, both in England and in Ireland, Scotland, and North America, and possibly around the world as well. But there's also class varieties, and there's vocational, professional varieties as well. Register variations were reflected in specialized jargon dictionaries, often nautical. There was John Smith wrote the Seaman's Grammar and Dictionary in 1641, which is remarkably popular. I guess people were just interested in the sea. Terms that often get used are slang and cant. Both are varieties or register with some kind of stigma attached. One talks about the cant of beggars or thieves. Maybe you've heard of thieves' cant if you've played Dungeons and Dragons or something like that. Here's some 17th century slang. I wrote that as for flang as a joke, but with the F, but it's slang. Dirty beau is a slovenly fellow. And it's funny, the word slut originally meant an unkempt or slovenly woman, and it only took on its sexualized meaning in more recent centuries. English manufacture this is a slang, and this might be a euphemism, right? A way of saying something more politely for ale, beer, or cider, as opposed, I guess, to wine. Gape seed is an astonishing sight. That I think it's very funny. It's a good kenning as well, like link bait. Mulligrubs down in the dumps. What's the matter? You look at mulligrubs. I like that one. Pick tank. A pick thank. Sorry, I misspelled that. Pick thank is a gossiping telltale or someone who spreads rumors to curry favor. And a thorough cough is coughing and farting at the same time. This is from the 1600s. You're welcome. Have a great day. Bye.